The farm never looked abandoned. That was the strange part. Even years later, even after the fences leaned and the paint thinned, the land still appeared occupied, like someone had just stepped away and would be back before dusk. The grass kept growing. The wind kept moving through the fields the same way it always had. Cicadas still rose and fell in waves every summer evening. Nothing about the place suggested a tragedy had happened there, and yet everyone who passed had felt the same quiet pressure in their chest, an unspoken awareness that something vital had gone missing and never returned. In 1989, 3 cousins disappeared from this land. Not dramatically, not in the way stories usually begin. There were no screams that carried across the fields, no shattered windows, no flashing lights cutting through the dark. They were simply there one day, and then they weren't. What followed wasn't chaos, but silence, a silence that settled slowly, almost politely, as if it didn't want to draw attention to itself. And then it stayed. For the people who loved them, the absence didn't feel empty at first. It felt temporary, like a pause, a delay, the kind you assume will resolve itself if you just give it time. Their names were still spoken casually in the early days. Someone would say, when they get back, without realizing how heavy that phrase would eventually become, their rooms were left untouched. Their tools stayed where they'd last been set down. The idea that they were truly gone felt too final, too sharp to accept all at once. The farm carried their presence better than the house did. Inside, the air felt different, stale in a way that had nothing to do with dust. But outside, the land behaved as if nothing had changed. The soil didn't mourn. The crops didn't hesitate. Whatever had happened to the cousins had not disrupted the rhythm of the earth beneath them, and somehow that made the loss harder to understand. If something terrible had occurred, shouldn't the ground have reacted? Shouldn't there have been a mark, a scar, something to point to and say, here, this is where it broke? Instead, there was only quiet continuity. People who lived nearby would later describe the farm as heavy, though no one could ever explain exactly what they meant. It wasn't fear, not at first. It was more like restraint, as if the place was holding its breath. Conversations felt shorter when they happened near the property. Laughter faded quicker. Even children seemed to sense it, lowering their voices without being told why. The land didn't repel people. It watched them. The cousins themselves were never introduced to the world as a headline. There was no single photograph that captured all 3 in a way that felt definitive. They existed in fragments. One remembered for a stubborn streak, another for being quietly observant, another for the way they laughed too loudly at jokes that weren't funny. They were family before they were individuals, tied together by blood and geography, and a shared understanding of what it meant to grow up with dirt under your nails and expectations pressing down from generations before. In the beginning, people talked about them in the present tense. Someone would say they'd probably gone off somewhere, needed space, wanted something different. Texas was full of roads, after all, full of places to disappear into, without meaning to vanish forever. The idea that the cousins might return was comforting. It allowed everyone to keep living, without rearranging their understanding of the world. But time has a way of testing hope. Days passed, then weeks, then seasons. The farm kept standing, unchanged, while certainty eroded around it. The silence grew more intentional. At some point, people stopped mentioning the cousins unless prompted, not because they were forgotten, but because remembering them out loud began to feel dangerous, like naming them might finally make their absence permanent. The house absorbed the quiet differently. Floors creaked where footsteps no longer followed. Doors stayed closed longer than they used to. Objects that once felt ordinary became artifacts, simply by remaining where they were. A jacket draped over a chair, a coffee mug left behind. These weren't clues. They were reminders, proof that life had been interrupted mid-sentence. What lingered most strongly was not fear, but uncertainty. Fear has edges. It can be confronted, named, reacted to. Uncertainty just spreads. It seeps into routine, into memory, into the way people talk about the past. Over time, even those closest to the cousins began to second-guess their own recollections. Did they seem unhappy? Did they talk about leaving? Did anyone notice something was wrong? The silence didn't just erase answers. It rewrote questions. Years later, newcomers would drive past the farm without knowing its story. To them, it was just another stretch of rural land, another example of Texas holding on to its past. But those who knew couldn't look at it the same way. For them, the farm was not a place. It was a moment that never finished happening, a pause that stretched across decades, a question left open so long it became part of the landscape. The strangest thing about unresolved loss is how it refuses to stay in the past. It doesn't fade the way sharp grief does. It doesn't soften into nostalgia. Instead, it hovers. It waits. Every anniversary passes quietly, unacknowledged by most, but deeply felt by a few. Every major life event, a wedding, a funeral, a birth, carries an unspoken subtraction. 3 people who should have been there, but weren't. 3 voices that never aged, never changed, never contradicted the versions of themselves that lived on in memory. By the time decades had passed, the disappearance no longer felt active. It felt buried, not resolved, just settled over, like soil smoothing itself after something has been pressed beneath it. The farm looked peaceful from a distance, almost forgiving. But peace and truth are not the same thing. And sometimes silence is not the absence of sound. It's the presence of something waiting to be uncovered. The land remembered, even when people tried not to, even when the stories stopped being told, even when the cousins' names were spoken less frequently, more carefully, as if they were fragile objects that might break if handled too roughly. The silence that followed them was never empty. It was full of unanswered questions, full of time, full of something that refused to disappear, no matter how deeply it was buried. Long before anyone thought of the farm as a place where something vanished, it was simply where the family came from. Not everyone lived there full time, but everyone belonged to it in some way. The land had been passed down with stories attached to it. Stories about hard years, good harvests, stubborn decisions, and the kind of survival that didn't make headlines but shaped identities. By the time the 3 cousins were born, the farm was already more than property. It was expectation. It was obligation. It was proof that the family had endured. The cousins grew up knowing they were connected before they understood what that connection meant. Family gatherings blurred into one another. Holidays marked by folding tables, shared meals, and conversations that repeated themselves every year. They were close in age, close enough that adults often spoke of them as a unit rather than individuals. The boys, some would say, even when they were no longer boys at all. That closeness created comfort, but it also erased space. It left little room to be different without being noticed. Each cousin carried the weight of that environment differently. One felt most at home on the land, finding reassurance in routine and physical labor. The farm made sense to him. The rules were clear. You worked, and the land responded. Another cousin saw the farm as a responsibility he hadn't chosen but couldn't refuse. He did what was expected, but his thoughts wandered elsewhere, toward cities he'd never seen, lives he'd only imagined. The third stood somewhere in between, loyal to family yet quietly observant, aware of tensions that others pretended not to feel. Their shared bloodline didn't erase those differences. It amplified them. Living and working so closely together meant there was no escaping comparison. Every decision, who worked harder, who complained less, who talked about leaving, became part of an unspoken ledger. No one kept score out loud, but everyone felt it, especially in a place where pride mattered and silence was often mistaken for strength. The farm itself was not harsh, but it was demanding. Days started early and ended late. There was little room for hesitation. Generations before them had survived by understanding that the land didn't wait for anyone. If something needed to be done, it was done. Feelings came second. Dreams, if they existed at all, were something you held quietly, like a private rebellion. Older relatives reinforced that mindset without meaning to. They spoke often about sacrifice, about staying, about how leaving was sometimes framed as betrayal. The cousins absorbed those lessons differently. For one, they became a source of pride. For another, they felt like a cage. For the third, they were simply facts, neither comforting nor threatening, just present. There were moments of genuine closeness between them. Late nights after work, when exhaustion stripped away tension. shared jokes that only made sense to people who had grown up together, the kind of familiarity where words weren't always necessary. But even those moments carried an undercurrent of something unresolved. Small disagreements lingered longer than they should have. Conversations stopped just short of honesty. Certain topics, money, inheritance, the future, were approached carefully or avoided altogether. The boundaries between family and land were never clear. Arguments about work were also arguments about identity. Decisions about the farm felt personal, even when they were practical. Who had the right to decide what happened there? Who carried more responsibility? Who would eventually leave? And who would stay behind to hold everything together? No one ever sat down to define those roles. They emerged quietly, shaped by age, temperament, and expectation. And like most unspoken arrangements, they created resentment simply by existing. Resentment didn't always look like anger. Sometimes it looked like withdrawal, like sarcasm, like long silences at the dinner table. Outsiders often assumed the cousins were lucky. They had land. They had family. They had stability. What those outsiders couldn't see was how closely stability can resemble stagnation when there's no room to change. The farm provided food, shelter, and purpose, but also demanded loyalty without negotiation. There were whispers, even before 1989, that not everyone wanted the same future. One cousin talked occasionally about opportunities elsewhere, framing them as possibilities rather than plans. Another dismissed those ideas, insisting that everything they needed was already there. The third listened more than he spoke, absorbing both perspectives without fully committing to either. Those differences didn't cause open conflict, but they created fault lines, tiny fractures beneath the surface that didn't matter, until suddenly they did. The land, for all its openness, didn't offer many places to hide. Everyone noticed when someone was distant. Everyone remembered offhand comments, even if they didn't seem important at the time. Later, those moments would be replayed endlessly, examined for meaning they may never have had. A passing remark, a look held too long, a disagreement that ended without resolution. Family history is often told as a straight line, but in truth, it's a web of moments and misunderstandings. By the late 1980s, the cousins were no longer children bound together by circumstance. They were adults standing at the edge of choices they didn't know how to make without disappointing someone. The farm stood at the center of all of it, patient, unmoving. It had seen generations struggle, compromise, and endure. It didn't take sides. It didn't offer guidance. It simply remained, absorbing whatever projected onto it. When people later tried to understand what might have happened, they often returned to these early dynamics, not because they provided answers, but because they revealed pressure, a quiet accumulation of expectations and desires pulling in different directions. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, just the kind of emotional tension that doesn't announce itself until something finally breaks. At the time, though, none of this felt dangerous. It felt normal, like family, like life unfolding the way it always had. The cousins were still there. The land was still theirs. The future, whatever it held, felt distant enough to ignore. And that was the illusion everyone lived inside, the belief that time would always provide more chances to speak, to choose, to change. That whatever wasn't resolved today could wait until tomorrow. On the farm, tomorrow always came, until one day it didn't. The day began without ceremony, no sense of arrival, no feeling that something important was about to happen. Morning light stretched across the fields the same way it always had. Thin and pale at first, then stronger as the sun climbed higher. The farm woke up slowly, as if it had all the time in the world. For the cousins, it was just another day, one that didn't ask to be remembered. They moved through their routines almost on instinct, boots pulled on without thought, doors opened and closed. The familiar sound of property filled the air, metal against metal, the distant lowing of cattle, the wind shifting through tall grass. Nothing felt urgent. Nothing felt final. If there were thoughts of the future that morning, they were quiet ones, tucked away behind the demands of the present. Conversations were brief and practical. What needed fixing? What needed checking? What could wait until tomorrow? One cousin lingered longer over his coffee, staring out a window as if measuring something he couldn't name. Another joked about the heat, already anticipating how heavy the afternoon would feel. The third listened, responding when necessary, his attention split between the words being spoken and the work ahead. If anyone noticed tension, it blended seamlessly into the background. On a farm, tension was constant, whether money, machinery, time. Emotional undercurrents rarely stood out. They became part of the landscape, as ordinary as dust settling on the floor. At some point, someone mentioned leaving the property later that day. It wasn't framed as a plan, more like a possibility, an errand, a vague intention. The kind of comment that doesn't demand follow-up. No one pressed for details. No one asked when they'd be back. The assumption of return was automatic. The hours passed in pieces. Sunlight shifted. Shadows moved. Work was done in segments, interrupted by pauses that felt earned rather than forced. One cousin worked longer in the field, preferring the solitude. Another moved between tasks quickly, restless without fully understanding why. The third stayed close to the house, handling smaller jobs that kept him within earshot of everything. There were moments that would later be examined closely, though at the time they seemed meaningless. A glance exchanged without explanation, a conversation cut short, a decision made and unmade. These were not clues. They were fragments of an ordinary day, only made significant by what followed. By early afternoon, the heat pressed down heavily. Movement slowed. Voices grew quieter. Even the animals sought shade. The farm settled into that suspended state, where time feels thick, where hours stretch longer than they should. It was a kind of day that encouraged reflection, even if no one admitted out loud. One cousin stood at the edge of the property for a while, looking out toward the road, not waiting for anything specific, just watching. Another stayed busy, as if stillness made him uneasy. The third moved between them, bridging spaces without quite connecting. Lunch, if it happened, was informal, something grabbed quickly. No shared table, no prolonged conversation. The lack of ceremony didn't feel wrong. It felt familiar. They had eaten like this countless times before. As the afternoon wore on, plans remained undefined. The idea of leaving resurfaced briefly, then faded. Someone mentioned something they'd take care of later. Later always felt guaranteed. There was no sense of running out of time. The sky began to change as evening approached, colors deepening. The air cooling slightly. Work slowed further. Tools were put away without much discussion. It was the hour when the day usually began to fold into itself, when the farm prepared for night. If there was a final conversation, no one remembered it clearly. If there was a moment when something could have been said, something honest, something clarifying, it passed unnoticed. The day didn't announce its ending. It simply continued, slipping quietly into dusk. Night on the farm had its own rhythm. Sound sharpened. The world narrowed to what could be seen and heard nearby. Lights came on inside the house. Outside, darkness settled gently, without threat. The cousins had lived through countless nights like this. Nothing about it suggested danger. And then, without spectacle, without warning, the ordinary day ended differently than all the others. No one marked the moment when the cousins were last seen as significant. No clock was checked. No mental note was taken. The farm absorbed their presence the same way it always had, and then at some point, it didn't give it back. Later, when people tried to reconstruct that day, they searched desperately for meaning in its mundanity. They asked what had been said, what had been done, what had been felt. They wanted a turning point, a signal, a mistake. But the truth was harder to accept. There was no obvious break, no dramatic shift, just a gradual transition from presence to absence. That final ordinary day became extraordinary only in retrospect. It was remembered not for what happened, but for what failed to happen. No goodbyes, no arguments, no declarations, just a series of small, forgettable moments that collectively became the last time things were normal. What haunted people most was not the idea that something terrible had occurred, but that it unfolded inside such a familiar frame. That the cousins had gone about their lives as if the future were intact. That they had trusted the continuity of the world right up until it stopped including them. The day closed the way it began. Quietly, the farm stood under the dark sky, unchanged. Inside the house, lights eventually went out. Outside, the fields rested. Nothing in the landscape recorded what had just ended. Only later would that day be replayed endlessly, slowed down, scrutinized, stripped of its innocence. Only later would its ordinariness become the most unsettling part of the story. Morning arrived the way it always did, without urgency. Light crept across the fields, touching the edges of buildings, settling softly on the land as if nothing were wrong. For a brief moment, the farm existed in that familiar in-between state, where night had lifted but the day hadn't fully begun. It was the hour when routine usually took over. Doors opened, engines started, voices carried short distances before fading into work. But that morning, something fell off almost immediately. It wasn't panic. Not yet. It was absence noticed in small, almost dismissible ways. A door that usually opened stayed shut. Footsteps that should have crossed the yard didn't. Someone paused, listening, expecting a sound that never came. The first reaction wasn't fear. It was confusion. Maybe they'd gone out early. Maybe they were already working somewhere else on the property. The farm was large enough for people to disappear into it for hours without explanation. Time passed. The sun rose higher. Still nothing. Names were called out casually at first, the way you do when you assume the answer is nearby. There was no edge to the voices, no urgency, just expectation. When no one answered, the calls grew louder, sharper, carried farther across the land. Silence met them every time. That was when waiting began. Waiting has a texture. It stretches minutes into something heavier. It makes people stand still longer than they should, hoping movement might somehow interrupt whatever is forming in their minds. The idea that something could be wrong tried to surface, but it was pushed back down again and again. People don't jump to the worst conclusion about those they love. They negotiate with possibility first. Someone checked the house. Rooms were empty, but not disturbed. Beds untouched in a way that didn't make sense for the time of day. Belongings still where they'd always been. Nothing suggested preparation. Nothing suggested departure. The house felt paused, like it had been left mid-breath. Outside, the search widened slowly. Barns, sheds, equipment areas, places the cousins might reasonably be. The land, so familiar the day before, began to feel larger, less cooperative. Every corner searched without result tightened something in the chest. Questions started to form, but they were still soft. Did they leave together? Did someone need help somewhere? Did they go into town? Each possibility felt thinner than the last, but none were dismissed outright. Dismissing them would mean replacing them with something far worse. Hours passed. Morning slipped toward midday. Concern crept in quietly, disguising itself as practicality. Someone suggested checking the roads. Someone else walked farther than usual, scanning the distance for movement. The farm no longer felt like a place of work. It felt like a place that had swallowed something whole. When fear finally arrived, it did not announce itself. It settled. It took up space in the body. It made breathing feel shallow. This was no longer about someone being late. This was about the realization that something had interrupted the normal order of things. The first call for help was made reluctantly. Saying the words out loud made them real. 3 people were missing, not unreachable, not delayed, missing. The word itself felt too large a situation, like it didn't quite fit yet. But once spoken, it couldn't be taken back. Neighbors came. Family members arrived. The property filled with movement again, but it was frantic now, unfocused. Everyone searched with the intensity of people who believed effort alone might reverse time. Voices overlapped. Directions were shouted. Hope surged and collapsed repeatedly with every empty space uncovered. The land offered no explanation, no signs of struggle, no abandoned vehicle, no trail to follow. It was as if the cousins had stepped out of existence rather than out of sight. As the day wore on, fear sharpened into something colder. The realization set in that this was no longer a private worry. It was becoming a public emergency. Law enforcement was notified. Questions were asked. Timelines constructed. Each answer only deepened the unease. What time were they last seen? Where are they supposed to be? Did they mention anything unusual? People answered as best they could, but certainty was scarce. Everything relied on memory now, and memory had already begun to shift under pressure. Statements were second-guessed almost as soon as they were spoken. Was it yesterday they mentioned leaving, or the day before? Did they say they'd be back by evening, or was that assumed? Fear has a way of making the familiar feel unreliable. As night approached again, exhaustion set in. Search efforts continued, but hope thinned with every passing hour. Flashlights cut through darkness. Voices carried differently at night, sharper, more desperate. Every sound made hearts jump. Every shadow looked like it could be someone stepping forward at last. But the night gave nothing back. By the time the second morning arrived, fear had fully replaced waiting. There was no pretending anymore. The disappearance was real. It had weight. It had momentum. It was no longer something that might resolve itself if given time. For the family, this was the moment when everything changed. The shift from when they get back to if they get back happened quietly, internally, without permission. It felt like betrayal to even think it, but the thought arrived anyway. The farm, once a source of grounding, now felt oppressive. Every familiar landmark became a reminder of failure. Places searched and researched, spaces that refused to yield answers. The land didn't comfort. It withheld. Fear spread beyond the property. Townspeople talked. Some helped. Some watched. The disappearance unsettled everyone, even those with no personal connection. 3 people didn't simply vanish from a place like that, not without reason, not without consequence. For the family, fear began to layer itself with guilt. What if something had been missed? What if a small decision, a delayed search, an unasked question had cost precious time? Those thoughts embedded themselves deeply, refusing to leave. Waiting was no longer passive. It was agonizing. Every phone call carried possibility. Every knock on the door spiked adrenaline. Sleep came in fragments, haunted by the same question looping endlessly. Where are they? The worst part wasn't imagining what might have happened. It was not knowing whether to imagine anything at all. The mind oscillated between hope and dread, never settling long enough to rest. Fear, once it arrives, doesn't leave easily. It reshapes days. It rewrites expectations. On that farm, it settled into the soil, into the walls, into the people themselves. And even as the search continued, even as others took over, something fundamental had already been lost. The certainty that the world made sense. From that moment on, every hour without answers felt heavier than the last. The waiting was over. The fear had arrived. And it was not going anywhere. When authorities finally took control of the search, the farm changed again. It stopped being a place of personal panic and became a location under observation. Cars lined the dirt road. Strangers walked the land with purpose, carrying notebooks instead of worry, radios instead of hope. Their presence brought a strange kind of relief at first. Official involvement meant structure. It meant rules. It meant that someone, somewhere, was now responsible for finding answers. But responsibility did not equal clarity. The first questions were simple, almost mechanical. Names, ages, relationships, last known movements. Officers wrote everything down carefully, as if order alone might produce meaning. The family answered again and again, repeating the same uncertain details until they began to feel rehearsed. Each repetition stripped the story of emotion, turning lived moments into data points that felt increasingly disconnected from reality. The assumption, at least in the early hours, was that the cousins had left willingly. Adults went missing all the time, especially in rural areas. People argued. People left. People needed space. This line of thinking wasn't malicious. It was procedural. But for the family, it landed like dismissal, as if the absence could be explained away by restlessness rather than something far more troubling. Search efforts expanded outward from the farm, but without direction, roads were checked. Nearby towns were alerted. Names were passed along quietly, without urgency. There was no dramatic mobilization, no sense that time was critical. The investigation felt cautious, almost hesitant, as if it didn't want to overreact to something that might resolve itself. Days blurred together. Interviews were conducted in kitchens and living rooms, voices lowered, notebooks always present. Family members found themselves being studied, measured, evaluated. Their grief became something to be interpreted. Their reaction scrutinized for consistency. Who had argued with whom? Who stood to gain if someone didn't come back? Who had been unhappy? These questions were asked calmly, professionally, but they left marks. Suddenly, the family wasn't just waiting for answers. They were part of the mystery themselves. Trust thinned. Words were chosen carefully. Even among relatives, conversations shifted. No one wanted to say the wrong thing. The land was searched again, this time methodically. Grid patterns, measured steps, areas marked and remarked. Dogs were brought in, their handlers reading signs no one else could see. The animals worked diligently, but they found nothing definitive. No trail, no clear direction. Just open space and too many possibilities. As the investigation continued, it became clear that it lacked a center. There was no focal point, no strong lead to pull everything together. Each theory floated independently, unsupported by evidence. The cousins might have left together, or separately. They might have met someone, or no one at all. Every option felt equally thin. This uncertainty began to exhaust everyone involved. The family grew frustrated, but they didn't know how to express it without sounding ungrateful. Officers were doing what they could, within limits that were never clearly defined. Resources were finite. Time moved on. New cases appeared. Attention shifted subtly, almost imperceptibly. What hurt most was the feeling that the disappearance didn't fit neatly into any category. There were no signs of violence, which made it harder to justify urgency. There were no confirmed sightings, which made it harder to track movement. There was no clear motive, which made it harder to frame a narrative. Without a narrative, the case stalled. Meetings became shorter. Updates grew less frequent. When family members called for information, they were met with careful language. No new developments. Still following up on leads. Phrases that sounded hopeful but meant very little. The farm, once the heart of the investigation, slowly faded into the background. It had been searched thoroughly. It had yielded nothing. Attention moved outward, chasing possibilities that stretched thinner with every mile. In the absence of progress, subtle judgments began to form. The idea that the cousins might have chosen to disappear gained quiet traction. It was easier, less unsettling. It allowed the world to remain predictable. If they left on their own, then nothing terrible had happened here. For the family, this was unbearable. They knew these men. They knew their habits, their fears, their limitations. Leaving without telling anyone didn't align with who they were. Leaving behind everything familiar, without preparation, without contact, it didn't make sense. But sense wasn't enough. Sense required proof. And proof was nowhere to be found. As weeks turned into months, the investigation lost momentum. Files thickened with paperwork, but not answers. The case became something officers reviewed rather than actively pursued. It was still open, technically, but it no longer moved forward. The family felt the shift acutely. The urgency that had once filled every conversation was gone. In its place was a quiet, bureaucratic patience that felt dangerously close to indifference. They began to understand that no one else would carry this the way they did. That realization changed them. They learned the language of investigations out of necessity. They asked sharper questions. They kept their own notes. They remembered details others dismissed. But without authority, without resources, their efforts felt symbolic more than effective. The system wasn't broken, exactly. It was functioning as designed. It prioritized solvable cases, clear crimes, visible harm. This disappearance was none of those things. It existed in a gray area that systems struggled to accommodate. What remained was a growing gap between those who waited and those who moved on. Each unanswered question became heavier over time. The lack of resolution didn't just stall the investigation. It altered memory. Events were revisited repeatedly, reshaped by speculation. What once felt certain became questionable. Confidence eroded. Even officers who cared found themselves constrained by limits they couldn't overcome. Without new information, there was nothing to push against. The case sat, unresolved, accumulating dust and quiet. For the family, the most painful realization was that the truth might never arrive on its own, that without something tangible, something undeniable, the disappearance could simply remain a question forever. And so the investigation settled into a state of suspended animation, not closed, not solved, just waiting like the farm itself, holding on to something unseen. When official answers failed to arrive, people filled the silence the only way they knew how, by talking. At first, it sounded like concern. Questions traded quietly at grocery stores, at gas stations, after church. Had anyone heard anything? Did anyone know something new? But concern, when left unanswered, has a way of mutating. It stretches. It bends. Eventually, it turns into story. The disappearance became communal property. No longer just a family's private nightmare. It was something everyone felt entitled to interpret. And because no single explanation emerged, many took its place. Each version was shaped less by evidence and more by belief, fear, and familiarity. Some said the cousins had planned it, that they were tired of the land, tired of the expectations, tired of being watched by a family that never quite let go. In this version, the farm was a cage they had finally escaped. People pointed to vague memories, something overheard years ago, a comment about wanting more, a restless energy that now seemed prophetic. It was a comforting story. It meant no one had failed them. It meant nothing terrible had happened. It meant the world was still orderly. Others disagreed. They believed the cousins would never have left like that, too close to family, too rooted. Instead, they whispered about outsiders, strangers passing through, deals gone wrong, someone who had crossed paths with the wrong people at the wrong time. This version turned the disappearance into a warning, a reminder that danger could drift into even the quietest places. It fed fear, but it also deflected blame. The threat came from elsewhere. Then there were the darker theories, one spoken in lower voices, after pauses meant to check who might be listening. These stories turned inward toward the family itself. Long-standing tensions were exaggerated. Minor disagreements were reframed as explosive conflicts. Ordinary moments were rewritten as precursors to violence. The farm, once seen as inheritance, became motive. Land always did strange things to people, they said. Money did too. Each retelling sharpened the edges a little more. The cousins themselves began to blur. In stories, they stopped being complex individuals and became symbols of rebellion, of tragedy, of secrets. Their personalities were flattened into whatever shape best served the theory being told. One became the troublemaker, another the victim, another the accomplice. None of these versions fully resembled the people who had once lived and worked on that land. For the family, hearing these stories was like losing the cousins repeatedly. Every rumor stripped away a little more truth, replacing it with speculation that couldn't be challenged without sounding defensive. Correcting people felt pointless. The stories had already taken root. They were easier to remember than uncertainty. Time only made it worse. As years passed, the disappearance shifted from recent event to local legend. New residents learned about it secondhand, filtered through retellings that favored drama over accuracy. Details changed subtly. Distances grew longer. Conversations became arguments. The timeline bent. What had once been unclear was now confidently misremembered. Theories hardened into beliefs. Some people claimed to know exactly what had happened, despite never having set foot on the farm or spoken to the family. They spoke with certainty that bordered on performance. Their confidence made the story feel finished, even though it wasn't, especially because each confident explanation contradicted the last. The absence of truth created a vacuum, and into that vacuum poured imagination. What hurt most was how casually the disappearance was sometimes discussed, as entertainment, as something to debate over drinks or bring up as a curiosity. The family would overhear their own loss summarized in a sentence, reduced to intrigue. 3 lives compressed into a rumor. And yet, silence wasn't much better. When the story wasn't being told, it was being forgotten. The cousins' names appeared less frequently. Their faces faded from collective memory. They became those guys on the farm instead of people. For the family, this felt like erasure. For the town, it was simply the passage of time. Rumors also began to turn the family inward. Relatives wondered who had said what, who might have fueled which version of events. Old grievances resurfaced, now reframed through suspicion. Trust frayed. Conversations became guarded. Even shared grief wasn't immune to doubt. People started to reinterpret the past through the lens of the disappearance. Every argument took on new weight. Every moment of distance felt significant. The story rewrote itself backward, reshaping memories that had once felt solid. And still, nothing was proven. Theories came and went, rising briefly before collapsing under their own contradictions. But the damage lingered. Each story left residue. Each suggestion changed how people looked at one another. The absence of answers didn't just create mystery. It created division. For the cousins, being missing meant existing in an unstable state. They were not confirmed victims, not confirmed survivors, not allowed to rest in certainty. They existed only as possibilities, endlessly rearranged by the people who talked about them. The family learned to brace themselves whenever the topic came up. They learned which versions hurt the most, which ones suggested abandonment, which implied guilt, which treated the disappearance as a puzzle rather than a wound. There were moments when even they wondered, when exhaustion weakened certainty and questions crept in uninvited. What if they had wanted to leave? What if there had been things they hadn't known? These thoughts felt like betrayals, but they arrived anyway, carried by the same doubt everyone else seemed so comfortable entertaining. The stories had power. They shaped perception. They influenced how the case was remembered, how seriously it was taken, how much attention it received. Once a narrative took hold, it was difficult to dislodge, even when it was built on nothing more than speculation. Over time, the loudest voices weren't the most informed. They were the most confident. And confidence, especially in the absence of facts, can be persuasive. The disappearance became less about what happened and more about what people believed could have happened. The distinction blurred. For some, the theories replaced the need for truth altogether. It was easier to live with a story than with a question. But for the family, the question never went away. Every rumor reopened the wound in a different way. Some brought anger. Others brought shame. Some brought a flicker of hope, quickly extinguished when nothing came of it. The emotional toll was cumulative, layered year after year. The town eventually moved on. As towns do, new stories emerged. New tragedies took focus. The disappearance slipped into the background, resurfacing only when someone new discovered it or someone old decided to retell it. But beneath all the versions, beneath all the speculation, the truth remained untouched, untold, buried beneath words that had nothing to do with it. And perhaps that was the most unsettling part of all. Not that people talked, but that talking had become a substitute for knowing. The stories filled the gap so completely that the absence of answers began to feel normal. The cousins were gone. The reasons were optional. And somewhere beneath the noise of rumor and theory, the truth waited, unchanged, unmoved by belief, patient enough to outlast every story told in its place. Time did not move forward for the family in a straight line. It stretched, folded back on itself, stalled without warning. The disappearance became a fixed point around which everything else revolved, even when no one spoke about it. Life continued, because it had to, but it did so unevenly, carrying the weight of something unresolved. In the early years, there was still a sense of suspension. Birthdays passed with an unspoken assumption that the cousins might still be somewhere, alive, marking time in their own way. Holidays were approached cautiously, as if celebration itself might be inappropriate. Chairs remained empty, not symbolically, but practically. No one suggested filling them. It felt too soon, even when years had already gone by. As parents aged, the waiting changed shape. It lost some of its urgency and gained a deeper ache. Hope did not disappear, but it became quieter, more private. It learned to coexist with exhaustion. Some days, imagining the cousins alive somewhere felt comforting. Other days, it felt cruel, like prolonging a wound that refused to close. The farm became a strange anchor in all of this. It remained, physically unchanged in many ways, while the people connected to it shifted and wore down. Fields were worked less aggressively. Projects were postponed indefinitely. Repairs were made only when necessary. The land was no longer something to build upon. It was something to preserve, as if change itself might erase the last tangible connection to the cousins. Walking the property became an exercise in memory. Every path held echoes. Every structure carried associations that could not be separated from the people who had once moved through them. The barn wasn't just a barn. It was where someone used to stand at the end of the day, wiping sweat from their face. The fence line wasn't just a boundary. It was where arguments had ended and reconciliations had quietly begun. Grief without certainty is unlike other kinds of loss. There is no ritual that fits it, no funeral to gather around, no grave to visit. The family existed in a state of emotional limbo, unsure whether mourning fully would mean giving up, and unsure whether hoping meant denying reality. Both options felt wrong, so they did neither completely. Conversations changed. The cousins' names were spoken less often, not because they were forgotten, but because saying them invited questions no one could answer. When they were mentioned, the room shifted. Voices softened. Eye contact broke. Someone would inevitably change the subject, not out of cruelty, but out of survival. Children grew up in the shadow of the disappearance. They learned early that certain topics carried weight. They absorbed the tension without understanding it fully. For them, the cousins were stories rather than people, but stories told with unusual care. They sensed that something important had been lost, even if they couldn't articulate what. As the years went on, the family learned how to perform normalcy. They attended weddings. They celebrated milestones. They laughed when appropriate. From the outside, they appeared intact, but inside, everything was measured against the absence. Every joy felt slightly incomplete. Every achievement came with a quiet awareness of who should have been there to witness it. Guilt threaded itself through the waiting. Guilt for moments of happiness. Guilt for days when the disappearance didn't dominate their thoughts. Guilt for wanting peace more than answers sometimes. Grief became something managed rather than expressed. The investigation lingered in the background, officially open but functionally still. Occasionally, a phone call would come, usually about a lead that dissolved quickly. Each call brought a surge of adrenaline, followed by disappointment that settled deeper than the last. Over time, even those calls became rare. The family stopped expecting resolution from outside sources. They adjusted to the idea that whatever answers existed might never arrive. This was an acceptance so much as adaptation, a way to keep breathing without constantly reopening the wound. The cousins aged only in memory. In photographs, they remained frozen at the ages they were when they disappeared. Faces that never changed while everyone else grew older around them. This created a strange disconnect. The people remembered were no longer aligned with the world as it was. They belonged to a version of life that had ended abruptly. As parents grew older, fear shifted again. Not fear for what had happened, but fear of not knowing before it was too late. The idea of leaving this world without answers felt unbearable. It turned the disappearance into a race against time, one that could not be won through effort alone. Some family members held on to routines as a form of control, visiting the same places, maintaining the same traditions. Others distanced themselves, unable to remain close to reminders that hurt too much. This created quiet divisions, not arguments, but distances that were never fully bridged. The farm stood at the center of all of it, unchanged in its presence, altered in its meaning. It was no longer just land. It was a question, a reminder, a place where something had stopped mid-motion and never resumed. At times, family members wondered whether staying connected to the farm was an act of loyalty or punishment, whether letting go would be a betrayal or mercy. No one could agree, and so nothing changed. Anniversaries came and went, each one marked privately. If at all, there were no public commemorations. No official acknowledgments, just quiet recognition among those who remembered exactly what had been lost and when. As decades passed, the disappearance receded from public consciousness almost entirely. New generations in the area grew up without knowing the story. The farm became just another piece of rural land to them. But for the family, it remained sacred and cursed in equal measure. They carried the weight differently as they aged. Some softened, some hardened, some retreated into themselves. Grief does not resolve neatly. It rearranges itself repeatedly, adapting to the person carrying it. There were moments of anger, sharp and sudden. Anger at the lack of answers. Anger at the rumors that had circulated so freely. Anger at the way the world kept moving, without acknowledging what had been left behind. But anger, like hope, was exhausting to sustain. Eventually, it settled into something quieter. The absence became woven into identity. It shaped how decisions were made, how risks were assessed, how trust was given. The family became cautious of the future, aware of how quickly it could fracture. Despite everything, there were moments of peace. Brief, unexpected. Times when memory softened rather than stung. When thinking of the cousins brought warmth instead of ache. These moments were treasured, even if they were fleeting. Still, the question lingered, always present, even when unspoken. Where are they? What happened? Why did the world never answer? The family learned to live with those questions without letting them consume every breath. But they never truly left. They lived alongside them, quiet companions to every passing year. By the time decades had gone by, the disappearance felt both distant and immediate, like a dream that had ended long ago, but still influenced the day after. The farm remained. The memories remained. The truth, whatever it was, remained out of reach. And so the family existed in that space between knowing and not knowing, carrying a loss that never fully declared itself, waiting for something, anything, that might finally bring the waiting to an end. For a long time, nothing changed. The farm sat where it always had, weathered but standing, holding its silence without effort. Seasons passed over it in predictable cycles. Indifferent to what had been lost there, people aged. Some moved away. Others passed on. The disappearance faded from public conversation so completely that it began to feel like it belonged to another era, a story that no longer had any reason to continue unfolding. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the land began to shift back into relevance. It didn't start with suspicion or intuition. It started with practicality, ownership questions, maintenance concerns, conversations about what should be done with a property that no longer served the purpose it once had. The farm was no longer central to daily life. It had become an inheritance burdened with memory. Holding on to it required effort, money, and emotional stamina that fewer people possessed as time went on. Discussions about change were careful and uneasy. Every suggestion, selling part of the land, developing it, clearing unused areas, felt loaded. Not because anyone expected answers to emerge, but because change itself felt like a violation. The land had become a kind of memorial, even without markers. Altering it felt like disturbing something fragile. Still, reality pressed in. The buildings were aging. Equipment sat unused. Portions of property had become overgrown, reclaimed by weeds and time. What once felt sacred now felt impractical. And for some, there was a growing sense that leaving everything untouched wasn't preserving the truth. It was avoiding it. When work finally began, it was framed as maintenance, nothing more. Clearing brush, assessing soil, evaluating structures that had long been ignored. No one involved expected anything beyond the ordinary frustrations of dealing with old land. There was no anticipation, no dread, just a low-level discomfort that came from returning to a place weighted with unresolved history. The farm felt different by then. Not threatening, not ominous, just distant, like it belonged to another version of life that no longer existed. Walking across it no longer triggered immediate grief. It triggered memory softened by time. The sharp edges had dulled. The land seemed quieter than ever. That quiet was deceptive. As work progressed, people noticed resistance, not emotional, but physical. Areas that were harder to clear than expected. Ground that behaved strangely under machinery. Spots that felt denser, heavier, less cooperative. These things were not alarming on their own. Land does that. Soil settles unevenly. Objects are buried and forgotten. Farms are layered places, shaped by decades of use and reuse. Still, There was something about one particular area that slowed everything down. It wasn't marked. It wasn't remembered as significant. No one could say why attention lingered there longer than necessary. It simply did. Machinery struggled. The ground felt different beneath the surface. Not dangerous, just resistant, as if it had been disturbed before and never fully healed. At first, the response was technical. Adjustments were made. Equipment was recalibrated. No one suggested stopping. There was work to be done, and the past, for better or worse, had already been lived. But unease crept in anyway. Not the sharp fear of the early days. Not the frantic desperation of waiting. This was something quieter. A low, steady awareness that the land was behaving in a way that invited attention. That something beneath the surface didn't want to remain unnoticed. When excavation became necessary, it was approached carefully, methodically. There were procedures, regulations. No one rushed. Each layer of soil was removed with intention, revealing what the land had concealed for years. The first realization was not horror, it was confusion. What emerged didn't immediately announce its significance. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't self-explanatory. It was simply something that didn't belong where it was. An object out of place, buried deliberately, not naturally. Recognition came slowly, like a thought forming at the edge of consciousness. As understanding took shape, so did disbelief. The land had seemed so open, so honest in its emptiness, had been holding something all along, not hidden cleverly, not camouflaged with care, just buried deep enough to wait. The reaction wasn't explosive. There were no shouted revelations. Instead, everything paused. Movement slowed. Words were chosen carefully. The weight of possibilities settled over the scene, heavy but restrained. Authorities were notified again, decades after the first call. This time, the tone was different. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty about whether attention was warranted. The land had offered something tangible, and tangibility changed everything. The farm transformed once more, shifting from forgotten place to focal point. But unlike before, this return wasn't driven by panic or speculation. It was driven by gravity, by the undeniable presence of something that demanded explanation. For those connected to the disappearance, the news landed unevenly. Some felt vindicated. Others felt dread. Many felt both at once. The idea that the land had been holding on to something for all this time was difficult to process. It meant the truth had never been far. It had simply been silent. Returning to the farm now felt different. The air was heavier, not with memory, but with proximity. The distance that time had created collapsed suddenly. Decades folded inward. The past pressed up against the present in ways no one was prepared for. The land no longer felt passive. It felt like a witness finally stepping forward, not out of urgency, but because it could no longer remain still. Whatever had been buried there had waited long enough. There was a strange sense of inevitability to it all, as if this moment had always been part of the story, simply delayed. The farm hadn't forgotten. It hadn't forgiven. It had just endured. For years, people had searched memories, relationships, rumors. They had dissected words and behaviors, looking for meaning. All the while, the land itself had remained largely unquestioned, trusted by familiarity. It was the one thing that had never left. Now, it demanded to be reconsidered. The realization carried a quiet accusation, not of guilt, but of assumption, of believing that what was visible was all that mattered, of assuming that time erases rather than preserves. As investigation resumed, the farm felt exposed in a way it never had before. The silence that once defined it now felt charged. Every inch of soil seemed suspect. Every structure took on new significance. The place had shifted from background to evidence. For the family, the emotional impact was complex and contradictory. Relief collided with dread. Validation came with a renewed wave of grief. The idea of answers, once abstract, now felt close enough to hurt. There was no joy in the land's revelation, only gravity, only consequence, only the understanding that what had been buried, physically and emotionally, was finally refusing to stay hidden. The farm, unchanged in appearance, had crossed a threshold. It was no longer just the site of a disappearance. It was a keeper of truth, and whatever that truth turned out to be, it had waited patiently beneath the surface, shaping the silence all along. The discovery did not arrive with the force people expect from revelations. There was no single moment where everything became clear. Instead, understanding unfolded gradually, heavy and reluctant, as if even the truth itself hesitated to come fully into view. What lay beneath the soil did not scream its meaning. It simply existed, undeniable once seen, impossible to ignore once acknowledged. The object was industrial, utilitarian, out of place in a way that immediately unsettled everyone who stood around it. It had no reason to be there, not buried like that, not sealed away from the world with such intention. The longer it was examined, the harder it became to explain its presence through innocent reasoning. This was not debris forgotten by time. This was something put there on purpose. Silence followed the realization, not the quiet confusion, but the kind that comes when people instinctively understand the weight of what they are standing near. Conversations dropped to murmurs. Movement slowed. Even those trained to remain detached felt the shift. The ground beneath their feet was no longer just land. It was context. It was implication. Once authorities arrived, procedures took over, but the atmosphere remained tense. The farm, which had already transformed so many times over the decades, changed again, this time into a place of controlled focus. Tape marked boundaries. Notes were taken. Photographs documented angles and distances. Everything became deliberate. The tank itself became the center of gravity. Its size suggested containment. Its placement suggested concealment. Its condition suggested time. Every detail raised questions that could no longer be dismissed as speculative. This was not a rumor or a theory. This was physical proof that something significant had been hidden. For those who had lived with uncertainty for decades, the sight of it was disorienting. Some felt a strange sense of validation. Others felt their stomachs drop, with a dread they had spent years trying to keep at bay. The land they had walked across so many times had been holding something all along, not metaphorically, literally. The process of uncovering what lay within was slow and careful. There was no rush, no recklessness. Everyone understood that once crossed, this threshold could not be uncrossed. Whatever was inside would end the waiting, but it would also close doors that had remained open for decades. As time stretched, memories resurfaced with renewed intensity. People remembered spots on the land they had avoided without knowing why. Moments when the farm had felt heavier than usual. None of these memories provided answers, but they took on a new resonance, as if intuition had brushed against truth without recognizing it. The tank represented more than a discovery. It represented containment, of truth, of violence, of time itself. Something had been placed inside it and removed from a natural order of decay and exposure. It was an attempt to erase, to delay reckoning, and for a while it had worked. When the implications became unavoidable, the story of the disappearance shifted permanently. The idea that the cousins had left voluntarily collapsed under the weight of metal and soil. This was not escape. This was concealment. The question was no longer where they had gone, but what had been done. Families were notified carefully, gently, as if tone alone could soften the impact. Some already knew, deep down, that this was where the story was heading. Others had clung to alternate explanations for survival. Hearing that something concrete had been found forced those internal negotiations to end. Grief returned with a sharpness that surprised everyone. Decades had passed, yet the pain felt immediate. Fresh, as if the wound had never truly closed, only numbed. Now, sensation flooded back in. There was anger, too, not just at what had happened, but at how long it had taken for the truth to surface. Anger at missed opportunities, at assumptions, at the quiet ways systems had deprioritized a disappearance that didn't fit a clean narrative. Investigators approached the next steps with solemn focus. The tank was treated not as an object, but as a vessel of evidence. Every action surrounding it was measured. The past had already waited this long. It deserved patience now. As the story spread, public attention returned with intensity. Headlines spoke of revelation, of closure, of long-buried truth. But those closest to the case understood that discovery and closure were not the same thing. Finding something did not automatically make it easier to live with. The farm itself felt altered again, no longer just heavy with silence. It now carried a sense of exposure. Its secret was no longer contained beneath the surface. The land had given up what it was holding, and in doing so, it changed the narrative forever. What emerged from the tank, what it confirmed, what it implied, could never be fully absorbed all at once. It required time to process, to grieve, to accept. The truth did not arrive neatly packaged. It arrived fragmented, demanding interpretation and endurance. For the family, this moment marked the end of one kind of suffering and the beginning of another. The endless not knowing was gone, replaced by a reality they could no longer negotiate with. The cousins were no longer missing. They were no longer possibilities. They were victims of something deliberate, something hidden. The weight of that realization pressed down on everyone involved. It reframed every memory, every rumor, every quiet year of waiting. The story was no longer about absence. It was about what had been concealed in plain sight. The buried tank had done its job for decades. It had kept the truth contained, silent, unreachable. But time has a way of undoing even the most deliberate attempts at erasure. Metal corrodes, soil shifts, secrets surface. And once they do, they cannot be buried again. The farm stood unchanged as night fell, but nothing about it was the same. The land had spoken at last, and what it revealed would echo far beyond its borders, reshaping lives that had been waiting for answers longer than they ever should have had to. Once the discovery was confirmed, the past could no longer remain where it had been. It surged forward, demanding to be reconsidered, reinterpreted, reassembled. The story that people thought they knew, the one built from rumor, assumption, and long silence, began to collapse under the weight of what had been uncovered. Nothing could stay the same after that. Not the memories, not the relationships, not the meaning of the years that had passed. Details that once felt insignificant suddenly glowed with importance. Conversations replayed themselves in people's minds, stripped of their original context and examined under this new, unforgiving light. Words spoken casually decades earlier were now interrogated for hidden meaning. Decisions that once seemed harmless were revisited as potential turning points. The past, once distant and hazy, became sharp and intrusive. Investigators returned to old files with fresh urgency. Pages yellowed with age were reopened, reread, reconsidered. Statements that had once seemed incomplete were now recognized as warnings that had gone unheard. Timelines were redrawn. Gaps were filled not with speculation, but with the cold logic of evidence. The disappearance, once treated as an unresolved mystery, now revealed itself as something far more deliberate. People who had been questioned years ago found themselves answering again. This time, the questions felt different, more focused, less forgiving. There was no longer room for vague explanations or assumptions of innocence based on familiarity. The discovery had changed the stakes. It had introduced certainty into a story that had survived on ambiguity. For the family, this process was both validating and devastating. For years, they had insisted that something was wrong, that the cousins had not simply vanished by choice. Now that belief was confirmed, but confirmation came at a cost. It erased a fragile space where hope had lived, however quietly. The future they had imagined, however unlikely, collapsed completely. Grief reshaped itself once again. It was no longer the grief of waiting or wondering. It was the grief of knowing that the cousins' lives had ended not through chance or distance, but through an act that required intention. Knowing that they had been close, closer than anyone realized, while the family waited, searched, aged. The realization carried guilt in its wake, not because anyone had caused what happened, but because hindsight is merciless. People questioned why certain areas of the farm hadn't been searched more thoroughly, why certain assumptions had been allowed to stand unchallenged, why the case had been permitted to stall. These questions had no answers that could change the outcome, but they demanded to be asked anyway. The broader community reacted with shock, but also with discomfort. The stories that had circulated for years were now exposed as distractions, narratives that had allowed people to feel informed without being responsible. Some felt embarrassment at the confidence with which they had once spoken. Others resisted the new reality, clinging to old beliefs that were easier to live with. Rewriting the past is not a clean process. It creates fractures. People must confront the possibility that they were wrong, that they misunderstood, that they participated in erasure without realizing it. For some, this reckoning was quiet and internal. For others, it was defensive and loud. The farm itself became a focal point of this revision. Every inch of it was re-examined through the lens of what was now known. Places once dismissed as ordinary took on new significance. The land that seemed so open and uneventful was now understood as layered, capable of holding secrets beneath its surface without revealing them. Family members walked the property differently now. Each step carried awareness. Each view sparked a different set of emotions. The land no longer represented just memory. It represented proximity, how close they had been, all along, to the truth they were seeking. As findings were processed and conclusions drawn, the cousins' identities began to reemerge from beneath decades of speculation. They were no longer abstract figures in a mystery. They were individuals whose lives had been interrupted. Their personalities, once flattened by rumor, regained depth and nuance. They were remembered not as symbols, but as people. This reclamation mattered deeply to the family. For years, the cousins had existed in public consciousness as theories rather than humans. Now, their reality was undeniable. Their absence had a cause. Their story had a shape. It could no longer be rewritten at will. But closure, the word so often used to describe moments like this, remained elusive. Answers did not erase pain. They sharpened it in some ways. The family gained certainty, but they lost the ambiguity that had once allowed imagination to soften the truth. There was no longer space to wonder whether the cousins had found happiness elsewhere. The ending was final. Legal processes moved forward carefully, constrained by time and evidence. Accountability was sought where possible, but the passage of decades complicated everything. Memory had faded. Witnesses were gone. Opportunities had been missed. Justice, like closure, proved to be an imperfect concept. Still, something fundamental shifted. The cousins were no longer lost to uncertainty. They were acknowledged. Their disappearance was no longer an unanswered question, but a wrong that had been concealed. That recognition mattered, even if it arrived too late to change anything. The family began to speak more openly about the past, not because it hurt less, but because silence was no longer necessary. The truth, however painful, provided a foundation where none had existed before. Conversations that once stalled could now continue. Grief could finally be directed somewhere. The rewriting of the past extended inward as well. Family members reassessed their own journeys, recognizing how deeply the disappearance had shaped their lives. Choices made in the shadow of uncertainty were seen differently. Paths not taken were reconsidered. The absence had influenced everything, even when it wasn't acknowledged. In this new narrative, the cousins were no longer frozen in time. They were part of a completed story, however tragic. Their lives had beginnings, middles, and ends. That structure, painful as it was, allowed for remembrance that was grounded rather than speculative. The farm, too, settled into a new identity. It was no longer just a place of mystery or mourning. It became a site of truth, uncomfortable, undeniable, permanent. What had been buried there had rewritten not only the story of the disappearance, but the story of everyone connected to it. Nothing about the past could be undone, but it could finally be understood in a way it never had been before. And in that understanding, imperfect and incomplete as it was, something shifted. The story stopped circling endlessly around questions. It moved forward, carrying its weight openly at last. Developer mode. Even after the truth surfaced, not everything settled. Some things never do. Answers can close one chapter while quietly opening another, and this was one of those stories. The cousins were no longer missing the way they once had been, but their absence did not disappear with the discovery. It simply changed form. The farm still stood, outwardly unchanged. Grass continued to grow. Wind still moved across the fields in the same familiar patterns. To someone passing by, it looked like any other stretch of rural land. But for those who knew, It carried a different gravity now, not the suffocating uncertainty of before, but a solemn awareness. The land was no longer silent out of mystery. It was silent out of completion. There were moments when the family expected relief to arrive, as if knowing the truth would lift the weight they had carried for decades. In some ways, it did. The endless loop of wondering was gone. The questions that had no answers finally had edges. But grief does not leave simply because it has been clarified. It stays, reshaped by certainty. What lingered most was a sense of time lost. Decades spent waiting. Decades shaped by not knowing. Lives lived cautiously, always accounting for the possibility that answers might arrive tomorrow. Now that tomorrow had come, it carried a quiet ache for all the years that could never be reclaimed. The cousins were spoken of differently now, with more confidence, with fewer qualifiers. Their names no longer floated in the air as questions, but rested as statements of fact. They had lived. They had been loved. They had been wronged. That clarity mattered, even if it hurt. Still, there were gaps that could never be filled, motives that remained partially obscured, moments leading up to the end that no one would ever fully reconstruct. The truth, though powerful, was not total. It left space, small but significant, for unanswered details that would always hover the edges of understanding. The community adjusted slowly. Some expressed remorse for the stories they had once told so freely. Others stayed quiet, perhaps unsure of how to reconcile their earlier certainty with the reality that had emerged. The disappearance was no longer folklore. It was history, and history demands a different kind of respect. For the family, remembrance became less complicated, though no less painful. They could grieve without negotiating with doubt. They could remember without correcting rumors. The cousins belonged fully to their own story again, no longer fragmented by speculation. There were days when the farm felt peaceful in a way it never had before, not because the pain was gone, but because the waiting was. The land had given up what it held, and in doing so, it released some of the tension that had defined it for so long. It no longer felt like it was holding its breath. Yet even now, something intangible remained, a feeling that lingered in quiet moments, a reminder that some truths take too long to surface, and that silence can be as powerful as any confession. The farm had witnessed everything. It would continue to witness whatever came next. The story did not end with sense of triumph or resolution. It ended with understanding, and with the recognition that understanding is not the same as peace. Some endings are not meant to comfort. They are meant to acknowledge. And so the land remains. The names remain. The memory remains. No longer suspended in uncertainty, but anchored in truth. The silence that once haunted the farm has changed. It is no longer empty. It is full of remembrance, of consequence, and of a story that waited 35 years to finally be heard.